welcome. It's a team from the News Service of Florida. And David, you and I usually talk together about matters of Florida government and politics, but this time you brought your colleagues after the election. So this should be fun. Let's have some fun about Florida and what happened in the election. David, everybody seemed to think, pollsters, that Romney would take Florida handily, but he didn't. What happened?
Well, first, the weird thing that happened is it didn't matter. That's right. Well, what happened is that the election was close, almost deadlocked, as it has been a few other times in Florida on election night. And it's still not entirely certain who actually won Florida a couple of days after the election. Because we've still got some absentee votes being counted in Miami-Dade County, and it was razor thin. Again, didn't matter. President Obama won without Florida, and that's unusual. It wasn't Florida, Florida, Florida this time. What happened as far as how did it get so close when so many of the polls were showing Romney up 4, 5, 6, even 7 in one poll in the 2 weeks before the election? I don't think people thought that Hispanics would turn out in the large numbers that they did and vote for President Obama. I think the women's vote was stronger for President Obama than people anticipated. It'll be interesting once we see all of the exit polling to sort of see exactly who voted for the president in large numbers that we didn't think were going to vote. In other words, why were those polls missing it?
Well, you know, it's amazing. I kept seeing him not only in Florida but everywhere, going to universities, and the young people really turned out, and they turned out in Florida, right?
Yes. Well, that's one of the things the polls might not be capturing is the young voters. Let's face it, young voters have cell phones, for one thing, which makes polling a little bit more difficult.
Okay.
Also, they did turn out, and I think there was a lot of doubt about that leading into the election.
All the polls are based on these likely voter models, and the Republicans were selling, and I think some of the pollsters might have been buying a little bit the idea that the Obama coalition, young voters, Latino voters, black voters were not going to turn out in the numbers they did in 2008. That didn't seem to pan out.
Brandon, what you're kind of saying is that the GOP underestimated the ground game in Florida, perhaps elsewhere.
And I think that's true. I mean, you look at the lines that were in some of these polling places, people were sitting there 6, 7, 8 hours ready to vote. When the early voting period ended, they got people to go and do the in-person absentee ballot, which was something that was significantly up from 2008. You know, a lot of the Republican spin heading into Election Day was the Democratic numbers on early voting are down. And I'm not sure, or at least the margin was down. I'm not sure how true that's going to turn out to have been when all the ballots are counted. What certainly is clear is that it was not down enough so that Romney's likely advantage on Election Day was able to carry him to a victory in Florida.
Jim, the I-4 corridor in Florida, it turned out to be a very real problem for the GOP. Talk about it. I know you've covered it, especially the Orlando area. A lot of stuff went on there, so tell us about it.
Well, the Democrats did well in Tampa Bay area as well as Orlando, and it wasn't just the presidential race. There were legislative surprises that came out in the legislative races on election night, a couple in the Tampa Bay area that I don't think anybody saw coming, but this goes back to what Dave said. I think we're seeing a greater influence of Hispanic voters, especially in the Orlando area. And obviously the Obama campaign did a very good job of targeting voters, targeting groups, and I think it had some down ballot implications as well.
And let's face it, the Romney campaign and Republicans in general made it a little easier for Democrats to go after Latino voters.
How so?
The immigration issue is the big elephant in the room. There are Hispanic Republicans who say, it's not all about immigration. Hispanics care about the same thing everybody else cares about. They care about the economy. They want jobs. And but in the end, I think when you've got a platform, as the Republicans do, that has elements in it that scare Hispanics, and Democrats are actively seeking out those Hispanics and trying to provide a home for them. I mean, I think the natural result is that Democrats are going to vote in large numbers for, or Hispanics are going to vote in large numbers for Democrats. And I think the numbers were really large. I mean, nationally, 70% of the Hispanic vote went to President Obama. It was a little lower in Florida because you had a lot of Cuban Hispanics that are still voting Republican. But that large influx in that I-4 corridor, I mean, you think of Osceola County just south of Orlando, huge numbers of Hispanics. And I think that was part of the result on Election Day.
One of the things that Marco Rubio talks about when he talks about this issue, I heard him talk about it in Tampa before a Latino group, is Latinos generally know someone who's an illegal immigrant. So the issue is a little bit more real to them. So even if they're legal immigrants, which they have to be to vote, you have to be legally in the country and a citizen, they know someone who's not. They know someone who's undocumented. And so it's not just a statistic, it's not just secure the border, it's men and women, it's neighbors, it's people they're familiar with that would be affected by those policies.
Brandon, there was a lot of discussion before the election about the changes to Florida's election laws and how they might impact the election. What in fact happened?
It doesn't look like they had much of an impact at all. I mean, again, you look at the long lines, and one of the things that was not maybe noticed as much is because of the way that the state had to get the law approved by the Justice Department, they basically had to require a day of Sunday voting in some counties where there had not been Sunday voting before. So you actually encouraged these Souls to the Polls efforts, where African American churches gather up as many voters from their church as they can on Sunday after church and go vote. And so I think in some ways you may actually have encouraged some black turnout with the way that the early voting law was structured. I don't think in the end it made as much of a difference as a lot of people were afraid it would.
Jim, let's move to the race for the United States Senate between incumbent Democrat Bill Nelson and former Congressman Connie Mack on the Republican side. Didn't get a lot of attention, I don't think,
yeah,
but you covered it, right?
Well, we were all involved in it a little bit. I mean, it turned out to be a pretty unremarkable race. I mean, Bill Nelson did what Bill Nelson does, which is not make mistakes, steady course. I sensed, especially at the Republican convention, sort of a lack of enthusiasm for the Mack campaign. I think they realized they weren't going to that no one was going to beat him in the primary, but then I didn't see a whole lot of enthusiasm going forward during the rest of the campaign. Nelson also did an effective job of bringing up some things from Mack's personal past that probably cast some doubt on him with just routine, regular voters. But I think Bill Nelson's one of the luckiest politicians in Florida. He ran against Katherine Harris, 6 years ago when the Republicans didn't, or independents didn't rally around her. That's for sure. And then he had Mack this time, and he's sort of just cruises along.
And I think Bill Nelson was probably helped by this Obama ground game that we're talking about. I mean, it doesn't look like he really needed the help. He won by quite a bit, but that surge in Democratic registration and turnout obviously probably helped pad his numbers a little bit.
Let's talk for a few minutes. Probably we'll go into break fairly soon, but let's talk about some of the races for Congress, perhaps that were surprising. The nation was following several of them. Let's talk about perhaps the one that was most watched by the nation between Democrat Patrick Murphy and Republican, I guess the word that you hear the most, firebrand, Allen West. That race is still up in the air as we speak because Mr. West is contesting it. Let's see, which one of you, Brandon, I guess probably I read stories by you more than anyone else about this race, but talk about that race, what it kind of symbolizes perhaps in the larger context and why it's important.
Well, first of all, I mean, you look at Allen West, here's a guy that was elected in this sort of Tea Party election of 2010. There was a big wave of conservative turnout across the state, and that helped propel him. Also, though, you look at redistricting. Because of the way that Allen West was redistricted, he actually changed seats. And I think that may have affected him some. He was with voters who did not know him as well. He was with some voters who may not have voted in his race the first time around. You look at somebody like Patrick Murphy. Murphy stressed, I'm a moderate Republican, but I don't like this Tea Party stuff. And he said that he was running against Allen West because of your quotes and your votes. And he successfully, I think, made a big issue of the fact that Allen West has a tendency to say things that are controversial, to say the least. He's compared Democrats to communists. He's compared their propaganda efforts to Joseph Goebbels. And I think that doesn't always sit well with people who may not necessarily agree with the Democratic Party, but they don't like that sort of partisan rhetoric. And I think when you bring that into a new district and you have the kind of Democratic mini wave we kind of saw in Florida this year, I think it makes it very hard for somebody like Allen West to get elected. The fact that he kept it close is a sign that it was still a pretty tough campaign.
He also was one of the top fundraisers among all congressional candidates nationwide, so I mean, he was on TV quite a bit.
He raised money a lot nationally, and I think that's part of what may have made him look a little bit more secure than he was the fact that he was able to draw on Tea Party networks nationally for funding. I'm not sure if that translated to votes, though.
David, let me ask you this. This is a big issue nationally, and Mr. West kind of symbolizes this for the Republican Party, is what's going to happen between the so-called establishment Republicans, whatever they are, but more traditional Republicans, and Tea Party Republicans as they define the party going forward.
This is what every one of those establishment Republicans is wondering and is talking about among themselves right now. What are we going to do about the Tea Party? And this is a developing story over the next 2 or 4 years and over the past 2 years. The Republican Party is split. You have this Tea Party element, which is a sort of a grassroots populist element, and is pushing the Republican establishment to the right on most issues and into areas where it's hard to get the middle to vote with you. The Republicans, I heard a Republican strategist this morning say, well, what this election made obvious to us is that we have to move to the middle. I saw Max Stepanovich quoted in the Washington Post saying the same thing, that we have to, we have to go after independent voters. Well, it's hard to do when you have the Tea Party pushing you away from those independent voters, and that's a critical problem for the Republican Party. They have to figure out what to do about that.
All right, let's go to break, and we'll come back and discuss other races and some other issues.